Welcome to the last video in Food is Your Foundation hormone program. In this video, I'm going to talk all about your gut and why it is so important for your overall hormonal health. So you may have heard about leaky gut, gut bacteria, probiotics, all these different things related to gut bacteria in the news. I feel like the gut is the thing that has completely changed, especially in the past 10 years, because of all of the research that's been coming out about it. And it's kind of exciting, the more research that's done on it, what we've been able to see is that there are different types of bacteria in our gut, and all these different types of bacteria have different impacts on our system. And as the research continues on gut bacteria, what we can see is that certain bacteria are present if people have diseases like Alzheimer's or autism. So what's exciting about the gut is that the way to change your gut bacteria is all with your diet, and it's with your food that you're consuming. And there's other components too that contribute to overall gut health, but the food is one of the most important things that you can put in that will help to change your whole what we call a microbiome, which essentially the microbiome is just referring to your gut bacteria. Okay, so what does this have to do with your hormones? Well, the gut bacteria play a role with estrogen metabolism. And what's been kind of exciting in some of the research that's been done on the gut bacteria is that your bacteria has what we call your estrobiome. So meaning that these bacteria play a role with estrogen, how it's being metabolized. When we look at some of the research that's come out on breast cancer, one of the ways to help prevent breast cancer is all through the gut bacteria, because the breast tissue actually has its own microbiome, meaning its own bacteria. Just like our mouth has its own bacteria, our bladder has its own bacteria, and all of these things are ultimately impacted by our gut bacteria. So if you have a bunch of bacteria in your gut that are maybe concentrating your estrogen levels, that can actually create the state of what we call estrogen dominance, which can set you up for lots of hormone problems. Sometimes it can trigger hot flashes for women, be a trigger for insomnia or fibroids, cysts, heavy bleeding. So what we want to do is we want to optimize our estrogen levels as much as we can in our system so we don't get into the state of estrogen dominance. So first I want to touch a little bit on just digestion and how that all works and what happens in your digestive tract when you eat. So ultimately, digestion begins in your mouth with chewing, and when you start to chew your food, you secrete something called amylase, and this enzyme really starts the whole digestive process. So I always think about, when you're being told to slow down and chew your food, it's true, there's a reason for it. When you slow down and when you chew your food, you're ultimately going to start that digestive process. The more you chew your food, the better it's going to get digested. So slowly eating, chewing your food, from once you consume the food and you've thoroughly chewed it, then it goes into the stomach, and your stomach secretes something called hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid is your stomach acid, which is actually really important. We want stomach acid. And in our world of antacid medications, this is actually not a good thing, because when you take antacid medication, it actually causes quite a bit of nutrient deficiencies. So we want to make sure we have optimal stomach acid in our gut, and especially the stomach acid is what helps to break down protein. From there, it goes into the small intestine, and as the food is starting to travel down that area, your pancreas start to secrete some enzymes as well to help to break things down, along with your gallbladder secreting some bile acids that help to break down fat. And then we also have the gut bacteria come into play, which also help to digest your food. So you have all these different parts that are really important to help with optimal digestion. And if you have a for lack of a better word, defect in any of these systems and it's not working properly, it's going to impact your ability to properly digest and absorb food. So one of the most common things that I see in my clinic, and I think is common just for a lot of people, is this phenomenon of what we call leaky gut, but a better word for it would be increased gut permeability. And it used to be, when I was in school, this was actually being talked about back in 1997 when I was in naturopath school, and this whole term leaky gut was kind of poo-pooed, thought it wasn't real, that it didn't really exist. And what's kind of exciting is that there's a researcher out of Harvard, if you follow Dr. Fasano and his work, he's actually proven in the past 10 years that yes, leaky gut or increased gut permeability does exist, and it's one of the root causes for autoimmune issues and why we're seeing so many more autoimmune issues happen in this country. So what is increased gut permeability? So what this is, and you can refer to the picture here, you should have these nice tight junctions between the cell lining in your gut. And when you have this increased gut permeability, what happens is these cells start to pull apart, and instead of those nice tight junctions, you have bigger holes in between them. So let's say you eat an apple, for example. Instead of being broken down into smaller particles to get through, larger pieces of it essentially get into the bloodstream. The immune system starts to recognize this as foreign, and that's how you get food sensitivities. And when you have increased food sensitivities, you're going to increase inflammation in the whole entire system, which can cause all kinds of hormone problems. So how do you get this leaky gut? There are multiple root causes for this. First of all, stress. Stress can be over exercising. It can be skipping meals. It can be having a very high carbohydrate meal or a high sugar meal. But anything that's going to impact your cortisol levels and stimulate high cortisol production is stressful to the body. And so this can start to wear away at some of that gut lining there and start to cause this increased permeability. Next thing would be heavy metals or environmental toxins. And we talked a little bit about environmental toxins, but when you have these exposures to these environmental toxins, they start to alter the gut bacteria in here, and those heavy metals as well can start to cause some permeability issues. Food sensitivities. Probably the most common sensitivities I typically see in the clinic are gluten, dairy, soy, and unfortunately eggs. This isn't saying that you can't ever have eggs, but what I'm saying is do not eat eggs every single day, because I see so many people react to them all the time. So we want to try to have a variety of these foods. And I do really feel like the biggest problem with our food is really what we have done with it. And when you have a lot of GMO food and food that has had a bunch of chemicals added to it, all of those things are not natural to the body, and they start to disrupt havoc on the gut. Any type of medication, but specifically antibiotics. Antibiotics are a huge root cause for increased gut permeability. One round of antibiotics can actually alter your gut flora for 2 years. That's right, 2 years. So think about people that get put on round after round of antibiotics, and they're not doing anything to help to reestablish the beneficial flora in their gut. They're going to have quite a bit of dysbiosis, meaning overgrowth of bad bacteria in there. Infections, gut infections. Gut infections are actually a huge problem. Lots of people have either an overgrowth of bad bacteria, candida, parasites, or other viruses that are in here that can basically cause low-level irritation to the gut. And when you have this low-level irritation all the time, it's going to increase this gut permeability. Now, we come into contact with a lot of these microbes on a daily basis, but it's a matter of if they stay there and they hang around there, then they can start to cause some problems. And then lastly, genetics. Our unique genetics can set us up to have more gut issues. And there are actually a couple different what we call SNPs. These are single nucleotide polymorphisms. So what that means is they're just little defects in your DNA. All of us have them. They're very common, but we all have different unique defects that are unique to us. And some people have defects in some of these different genes that actually impact their ability to have enough beneficial bacteria in there. So there's many reasons that people can get leaky gut or this increased gut permeability. And unfortunately, it's not usually just one reason. It's usually a combination of reasons. But as we're trying to heal somebody's gut, what we want to do is we want to start going through all these different potential root causes, and we want to start to address them to help to heal the gut. So when we're trying to fix somebody's gut, the thing I like to remember, and what's easiest for me to remember, is we want to seed it, we want to weed it, we want to feed it. So essentially think of your gut as like a garden, and we're trying to put in all this good fertilizer and just kind of make your garden be as healthy as we can. And you know, what do gardens have? They have bugs in there, so we don't want to wipe out all of the bugs in our gut. I mean, there are beneficial bacteria, there are beneficial yeast, there are actually beneficial viruses. We want to have a nice healthy mix of all of these things, but we want to have them in the right proportions. So what happens when you think back when we were just talking about gut infections, a lot of people get these gut infections because we are exposed to them all the time. But the reason people start to have a problem from them is because if you don't have enough of the healthy bacteria in your gut, when you get exposed to these different parasites, which again, they're everywhere, they're on our salad, they're on our food, they're in our drinking water. But if you have enough healthy bacteria in there, it's not a big deal. They just pass right through the gut and your body gets rid of them. Well, if you don't have enough of the right bacteria in your gut, then that's how those pathogens can take hold and hang around and then start causing some issues with the immune system and just some low-level irritation in there. So when we are seeding, weeding, and feeding the gut, the reason I do it in that order is because I have found it's important to seed first. Seeding meaning we're putting things like probiotics in and beneficial bacteria. And what we want to do is we want to start to slowly introduce these things in and make sure we have a good foundation to start with. When I have identified different gut infections and went in and tried to weed them right away, meaning I'm going in, I'm trying to kill them off with some herbal things, if the person doesn't have as much of those good gut bacteria, they tend to have more die-off symptoms from it, and they actually can get pretty sick. They can have a lot of flu-like symptoms, brain fog, fatigue, skin rashes, and so I want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So that way people don't feel that sick when they're going through this detox process. So again, that's why I put the weeding process second. And I like people to spend a good month seeding first with probiotics to get some of those beneficial ones in there. And some people can barely tolerate the probiotics, and that's just a sign of how imbalanced your gut is. And that just means you go slower. That's all. This isn't a race, and it's usually taken people a long time to get to where they're at. So you just start slowly nudging some of those beneficial bacteria in there. And then people, often if I've identified that there is a gut infection, which not everybody has one, this is why it's important to do testing and to work with a practitioner to see if you do. But if you do have some overgrowth of bad bacteria in there, you want to weed those out with some herbal supplements or other herbal things to help to knock those down. And then we want to feed your gut, and essentially what the feeding process is, we're feeding the beneficial bacteria to grow with what are called prebiotics and resistant starches. And what these do is they help to feed all of those beneficial bacteria to grow so they can start to flourish more on their own. So when you take probiotics and you stop them, your gut flora will turn back in about 2 weeks. So that's important to take note of, is that when you stop a probiotic, unfortunately, recolonizing your gut is not permanent. It can turn back in 2 weeks because the probiotics are transient, and so they essentially just move through your system. And then the other thing is that we have so many things in our environment now that disrupt our gut flora. It's really difficult to keep those good guys in there. So if you've followed any of the stuff on the news with glyphosate and Roundup, so Roundup is glyphosate, and glyphosate is found in everything now. It's high in wheat and grains, but it's even in organic grains, but it's just not in as high amount. But it's everywhere because it's been used so much, and essentially everything unfortunately has been contaminated with it. But Roundup was originally patented as an antibiotic. So what do we know about antibiotics? Antibiotics kill off our good gut flora, and they can disrupt all of that. So that's why it's really difficult, I think, to just do things with diet, because unfortunately a lot of our food is so contaminated now that the strains and the ancient strains of these beneficial bacteria, they're just not there. And it takes more effort to try to get these good bacteria in there to get them to stay around. So when people are taking a probiotic, at some point you want to try to put some of these prebiotics in, which are usually things like the abbreviated FOS, which stands for fructooligosaccharides. This is typically taken as a supplement, or you can do different foods that are what we call resistant starches. So resistant starch are things like white rice and white potatoes once they've been cooked and cooled. So it's important to remember the cooling part of it. Once you heat it back up, it actually takes that property away. But when you eat it cold, so think about like potato salad, that actually starts to act like a resistant starch and gets those good bacteria to grow. So why don't we start with this feeding process? Because when you're feeding the bacteria to grow, it doesn't decipher if it's a good or a bad bacteria. So if you have an overgrowth of bad bacteria and you have not done anything to kill some of that bad bacteria off, and you just start feeding it right away with these prebiotics, what you're going to do is you're going to make the bad bacteria grow even more. So we want to wait to put those in until the very end. And also when people start to put them in, you start with a very slow amount, because it can cause quite a bit of gas and bloating for people if they're not quite ready for it. So remember, we want to seed, then weed, then feed. That's how we're going to help our whole overall gut foundation. And think of the gut as a garden, and we're trying to keep our garden healthy, and we're trying to feed it as much good nutrients as possible. We want to try to include lots of vegetables and fruit into our diet, and even some of the fermented foods. And traditionally, that's how people got probiotics, was because they fermented a lot of their foods because they didn't have refrigeration. And the fermentation process gets a lot of these good bacteria to grow, and that's how people would seed their gut with the proper beneficial bacteria. Now, don't go crazy. Don't start eating, a whole jar of sauerkraut every day, because if you do too many fermented foods, they can cause a whole nother issue, which is a whole nother video and a whole nother on a whole nother topic, but they can be not a good thing. So we go back to everything in moderation. All it takes is like a tablespoon of sauerkraut. You could include things like yogurts, kombuchas, kefirs. You can ferment anything. And if you go into some of the health food stores, you can find, fermented cranberry sauce, fermented carrots, fermented beets. There's all kinds of different things there. But it just takes a little. And with any of this, if you feel more sick when you do it, it usually means you have some imbalance going on in there, and you're going to have to start a whole lot slower when you're reintroducing some of these things in. The other thing I want to say just about the gut and about the diet, one of the biggest things that I emphasize when I have people coming in and we're trying to put this strong foundation in place for their overall hormone health, one of the things I'll ironically take them off of is salad and raw foods. And I know it's like, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? I can't believe that you're telling me to not eat salad. That's healthy. That's what I've been told to do. Okay, hear me out. So part of my training is in Chinese medicine because I'm also an acupuncturist. And in Chinese medicine, the digestive system is referred to as what we call your middle burner. And the picture was always of like this little cauldron with a fire going, and anytime you ate, the food would go into the cauldron and it would be broken down and transformed into energy. So if you're eating a bunch of cold food and raw food, what that does is it puts the fire out, and then things start to stagnate and things start to become more bloated and the food just sits there. So that's why if you go to a Chinese restaurant, you can't get salad on the menu, because in that culture, they actually think salad is bad. And I always remember when my Chinese doctors came to school and they had first moved to there and were teaching in the program, and they couldn't believe we were eating like raw carrots and raw salad because that was like the worst thing you could do, especially if you had a gut issue. So if you have a hormone issue and if you have a gut issue, you do not want to be consuming a lot of raw food. You are going to make things worse. So think about steamed vegetables, stir fry, soups, stews, very gentle, easy to digest things. Second, you don't want to be consuming a lot of spicy food. And that includes things like garlic, cayenne pepper, because in Chinese medicine, those are very hot herbs, and those hot herbs can cause some problems with the gut, but they also can cause a lot of hormone problems. And everything is all about balance in Chinese medicine. So you want to consume foods that are balancing to your system. And if you are starting to have a whole bunch of hot flashes and insomnia, and then you start consuming a bunch of hot, spicy food, essentially you're just adding more fire, more fuel to the fire, because you're eating these hot things and you already got some heat going on in your system. So again, it's not, you can never have these things, but you cannot be eating large amounts of them because you will make things worse. You're going to make the hormone problems a whole lot worse too. So at the end of this video, you can look at some of the handouts. I have a couple of gut handouts for you on the seed, weed, and feed process, some beneficial foods that are healing to your gut. And I want to thank you for taking the time to complete this Food is Your Foundation course. I hope that you see big changes happen for you in the next 4 to 6 weeks, because changing your diet can have a huge impact in that short amount of time. So I look forward to hearing more from you and more questions, and you can look for further training videos to come.